If you want a vision of the future, Winston, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever.
You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth.
Someone is trying to teach me a lesson in futility. Why am I the only one who isn't killed?
They will run you dizzy. They will pile falsehood on top of falsehood until you can't tell a lie from the truth, and you won't even want to. That's how the powerful keep their power. Don't you read the papers?
I just want to say one word to you. Just one word.
Yes, sir.
Are you listening?
Yes, I am.
Plastics.
I'm going to get your money for you. But if you don't get the President of the United States on that phone, you know what's going to happen to you?
What?
You're going to have to answer to the Coca-Cola Company.
The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business, Mr. Beale. It has been since man crawled out of the slime.
Welcome to another episode of Our Interesting Times. It's my pleasure to have John Haskins on the show. John is a senior fellow for the Public Understanding of Law, Propaganda, and Cultural Revolution at the Inter-American Institute for Philosophy, Government, and Social Thought. He analyzes politics, society, the ongoing decline of the constitutional government, and the root causes of the failures and retreat of conservatism and religion in American society, and just maybe the world in general. So, John, how are you doing this evening? Thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, I'm doing fine. Thanks, Tim.
Is there anything else you want to add to that?
Oh, no. I bet you did it. That's
okay.
Fine.
So, John, you've looked into, the conservative movement. You've had some things to say about some of these organizations, particularly the Council for National Policy and its role in not only in conservatism, but in sort of the, politics, American politics, particularly since the 1980s, the conservative 80s, the Reagan era, and these things. And there's been some talk among the alternative media about the role of the Council for National Policy, the CNP, as being sort of a product of a conspiracy, more or less to bamboozle, manipulate the American public. And you have some problems with that term, and perhaps you want to refine it or maybe provide a better explanation of what exactly the role of the CNP is and how it relates to the wider, the wider American political system and power structure.
Yeah. Now, first, do you want to explain what the CNP is for your audience, or do you think everyone will know?
No, actually, we can get into it. The CNP, I believe the CNP was founded in the early 1980s, 1981. It grew out of the John Birch Society, the Western Goals, I think, Foundation, and it was sort of created as part of a conservative analog or counterpart to the Council for Foreign Relations, which has sort of been seen, I think, quite correctly, as sort of a coordinated committee for, the New World Order, for lack of a better term, but basically the corporations, the banking interest that form the power structure of the Anglo-American empire. And, of course, the Council for Foreign Relations was formed in 1921. And it's important to understand the Council for Foreign Relations if you understand the CNP, because the Council for Foreign Relations was formed in 1921 along with the Royal Institute of International Affairs, the Royal Institute of the RIA, the Royal Institute of International Affairs. That was, of course, the British analog to the CFR. It both developed out of the Milner Circle and the Rhodes Trust, and this idea to coordinate policy among the English-speaking peoples to more or less manage the world. So that's the CFR. Of course, the CFR is housed at Pratt House in New York, and that people like Dulles brothers came out of there, and they have, obviously experts in foreign policy, economics, culture. They also have, it's a very much large organization. They bring in celebrities and these things, journalists, and so that's their role. Sort of, I'd say, sort of perception management, control ideas, and coordinate policy. And
providing personnel, I think, for various White House.
Well, that's the important thing because Alpha, like the CFR, will staff administrations, the State Department, and later on, of course, the Trilateral Commission would do a very similar thing in the 1970s when David Rockefeller set that up with Zbigniew Brzezinski, and that was in response to the changing conditions in the 1970s to kind of coordinate and rope in Asia into these things, particularly Japan, the Trilateral Commission. And, of course, the Trilateral Commission would dominate the Carter administration. So that's kind of what the CNP tries to market itself as sort of the counterpart to the CFR and even perhaps to the Trilateral Commission. These New World Order institutions that, more or less control successive presidential administrations despite party affiliation. Is that good enough for you, or do you want to add something?
Well, no. I think you probably know more than I do about the CFR, maybe a lot more. My exposure to CNP, again, it's Council for National Policy. If we haven't said that full name, and I think they're in Washington. And as I mentioned to you, I've known, I don't know, I'm just guessing at least 24 current or former members, maybe much more, because you don't always know if someone's a member, and know Steve Baldwin, the former executive director, who was there for close to a decade. And Steve Baldwin, what I'm going to say, I'm going to have to be very coy about how I know some of this, because I shouldn't know some of it, but I think it's safe to say Steve was fired largely because of his perceived activism from within CNP and externally while he was there and trying to expose Mitt Romney in the 2008 campaign. I was very much involved in that. Steve had access to a lot of my information, and the allegation probably among the senior people at CNP was that he distributed to the media and various mostly conservative movers and shakers information that I and a very small group of other people generated. I have to put it that way because I think Steve probably had a severance agreement where he had to not say anything about CNP that would be damaging or not. So the disclaimer here is I'm not saying Steve Baldwin shared any internal secrets with me, but due to the considerable number of people that I've known who were involved in CNP, I did get what I felt was a very accurate sense of what it was about, not necessarily at the very highest level, where there were some people I considered to be very devious in a way that doesn't necessarily fit into the standard conspiracy theory framework in terms of motivations and agendas. Just that they're people who are cynical and not really going about anything good. The standard complaint about rhino Republicans, that type of a thing, which doesn't have to be a conspiracy.
No, it doesn't. It's just they're careerists, or they're looking for some sort of angle or inside track to profit personally from something.
Exactly, and they shy away. There's always money involved. There's always prestige involved. There's always appeasement of the mainstream media, as far as that can go for people that are self-labeling as conservatives or Republican, or whatever. You can only go so far in that pandering to the media, but In the end, people like that are embarrassed to be associated with people who have actual moral convictions and beliefs, and they are always trying to outmaneuver people who have a real value system, and they become skilled at posing as conservatives or as Christians or whatever, and some of them probably think they are.
Yeah, they sort of sell out gradually, so they don't notice it.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and I think that's by far the biggest. I think that's by far the most important way to understand what's wrong with the right and its institutions, as well as the part of American religion that that sort of labels itself as conservative by one definition. Or I think it's mostly not people that have infiltrated who are really antichrist or New World Order or anything like that. They're just sleazy people in many cases, and they're chameleons.
Yeah, and obviously those people higher up will find those people rather congenial or easy to work with, because it's very easy to work with someone once you know their price.
That's right.
Yeah, and then you can calculate from that point on how much you need to pay them, or they'll do anything for a paycheck, or they won't question anything if their paycheck depends on them not questioning it.
Yeah, and every personality in that category is distinct. I mean, I don't think like someone like a Mike Huckabee is especially similar to a Mitt Romney, or that they're all that similar to a George Bush or Dick Cheney. There's a lot of diversity there in terms of what people are all about. What they share in common is they are posing as people who have deep convictions whenever it's convenient or necessary. Some of them actually do have some kind of convictions. I doubt anyone in the Bush family does, or Cheney or anything. Not convictions that I would respect. But there are other people, I think, like Mike Huckabee and maybe Rick Warren, and the people who were at the nexus of religion and politics or social conservatism, who actually do, in most cases, actually have a belief system. I question whether it is a legitimately Christian and biblical system in terms of the way it works out in their lives. But anyway.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, with the Council for National Policy, the CNP, of course, we mentioned that it was created as a counterpoint, or as a conservative analog to what was considered the more liberal, centrist Council for Foreign Relations, the more corporatist. Well, what's interesting is that people who've analyzed the membership of the CNP found that quite often there are many who interlocking memberships between the CFR and CNP, which would tend to make you question whether it was a genuine, generally opposed to the Council for Foreign Relations.
Yeah, I think there's more than one way to look at that, Tim. The people that I have known who were, in some cases presently are members of the Council for National Policy don't have any strategic sense. They don't have. They're people who fudge things because they see themselves as, right at that perfect balance point between principle and pragmatism. And in the end, what they have to show for it after 30 or 40 years have gone by is absolutely nothing. And if you run something, if you're to found an organization like the Council for National Policy, and you have this naive idea back in the early 80s that, well, we have Reagan in the White House, and his people are all conservatives and constitutionalists and pro-life and pro-traditional marriage and family and whatever, we're now part of the power system. We're taking America back, and back in those days, even the National Review somehow passed itself off as conservative, and had even more so earlier. And I think there was a headiness, and a hubris. There obviously was, and I think that they could rationalize in their own mind. Oh yeah, you want to join, and you're also a member of CFR. Oh, that's brilliant. Yeah, because we're going to infiltrate them now. You know, I mean, it's that degree of naivete. There's tremendous strategic incompetence, tremendous instinct to compromise, as if, well, we're doing this for God and country, and it's gonna go our way. We win in the end. Well, what has been won in the end in the last 30 or 40 years from any of it? There's nothing to show for it.
And there's an interesting distinction to be made here, or at least an important distinction to be made between an outfit like the CNP and the CFR. Is the CFR, well, it had and it has real clout. I mean, it represents tangible, real interest. It represents the banking interest. It represents the Rockefeller empire. I would say it ultimately represents the Rothschild empire. And these things. These are the banking interests. These are the created. Created the intelligence agencies, the CIA. So when you talk about CIA, we're not necessarily talking about a bureaucracy, an alphabet soup agency. We're also talking about the milieu of interests that created it, that go back. I mean, these things, at least in the United States, go back to the founding of Skull and Bones and the opium trade and the vast financial fortunes and empires that were built from that trade. They were developed the banking system of the West and the central banking system, and this really that's when you're getting to the higher. I mean, you're getting closer to the tip of the pyramid there. Whereas the activists that were involved in CNP, these they have no real power. They may be able to marshal some votes and rally the base for a particular election.
I think they've lost that, even if they ever had it.
Yeah.
The CFR itself has obviously outstanding global connections. I don't mean globalist as much as global. Globalist is obviously globalist, but international connections in politics, probably commerce and industry, and certainly in media. But also they have ties to the most prestigious universities, certainly in North America, probably Europe. I mean, they move people around back and forth. They can make a phone call and place someone on a major TV program or radio program. Whereas if you're at the Council for National Policy, you're not the right-wing alternative. Even if you're right-wing, you're not the counterpart to CFR because you're not placing people anywhere. You're not. I mean, what you would have is people occasionally like. I think Gene Kirkpatrick was named it, as well as former governor of Wisconsin, Tommy Thompson, others who, some well-known law professors and various other politicians and appointees of Republican administrations who join essentially to get a Rolodex and to get a sort of a veneer of social conservative bona fides. But they're not. It's not like you go through CNP in order to move into power. Mm-hmm. It doesn't work that way. I don't think they have any clout. And I want to be very clear, by the way, that in case I wasn't, that Steve Baldwin, who was executive director, I have a lot of respect for him. His integrity is one of multiple reasons why I don't think the CNP could have been, in the almost 10 years he was there, an instrument of the CIA or anything like that. Steve is an impeccably conservative Christian man, and it's basically, as far as I'm concerned, I don't want anyone to take this as me relaying a quote from Steve, but in fact, I would say he's probably sacrificed his career because he had more decency and more integrity than his bosses did there, and I would say than the vast majority of the members, I would think, certainly based on the ones that I've known.
Now, a good example is, I mentioned that the Council for Foreign Relations is housed in the Pratt Mansion in New York, and of course the name, the former Secretary of State George P. Shultz, that stood for Pratt. And so that shows that the familial connections here, that the people that become Secretary of State, that end up being the president or CEO, of Bechtel Corporation, or these things, or they have these family connections that tie back to the Rockefeller empire, the big oil, these things that really are the financial backbone or the financial center of what we call the establishment. And they have these international corporations, whether it's banking or oil, even even fruit, like United Fruit Company. They can make a phone call and have the CIA arrange a coup for their benefit, like they did in Guatemala in 1954, or in 1953 when the Seven Sisters, the oil companies, got the CIA to arrange a coup in Iran because Mossadegh had nationalized the oil fields there and kicked out the British Petroleum. And so that's the name of the game, is that the CIA is an agency acting on behalf of somebody or something, and what they're acting on behalf of all these corporations. That ultimately these transnational corporations with huge resources at their disposal, and because they have these resources at their disposal, they can leverage that power to control governmental policy, and have the agencies themselves sort of socialize the risks of their economic or their business ventures while privatizing the losses. And that's what we see played out throughout Africa or Central America or even Europe, and these things. They're doing it for the benefit of these corporations.
Now, what's the connection between what you just said and CNP? Is there?
Oh, I'm saying this is the distinction between CFR and CNP.
You mean that CFR? Yeah, has the money in the cloud. Exactly.
Yeah. When you're looking at CFR, you're getting a window into the New World Order, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, I would think at the highest levels or the inner circles.
Yeah.
I think that's quite clear.
Yeah, whereas CNP, I think the CNP again it was created to. You can make the connection, the CNP perhaps being indirectly linked to the Central Intelligence Agency, because the Central Intelligence Agency is very concerned with controlling domestic politics. In fact, I would argue more so than foreign affairs, is they controlling the domestic front more importantly, because they have to maintain the perception of things, the legitimacy of its mission, or legitimacy of American foreign policy and these things. And so propaganda and cultural warfare, psychological warfare is a very important in maintaining the illusion of things, maintaining the illusion that the CIA is an intelligence agency. But by my point, CNP could be an example, and I think, of the intelligence agencies and the foundations which interlock with the intelligence agencies, like Ford Foundation or the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation. They would have an interest in sort of creating grassroots conservative organizations, movement conservative organizations, so they can more or less corral and control the opposition, controlled opposition. And many of the people involved in these organizations have no idea that they're being manipulated, because they're at a certain level. Whereas at the higher level, the funding, the things that can be taught, what's considered acceptable discourse in public affairs is being directed and controlled. And that's how these organizations are controlled. And the CNP would be a good way to control the opposition to make sure that it's manageable. You see what I mean?
I certainly understand the theory, and this reminds me of an interview that, if I remember, you did a few weeks ago with someone called John Adams. Is that right?
Yes, John, yeah.
Okay, and he has a very interesting story along the lines of what you're talking about now, except that it goes into the actual evangelical churches as well in Southern California. I would never have connected the dots the way he does. I can't say that I absolutely don't believe any of it, but Tim, my experience with evangelicals, leaders, and in the actual church world, but also in the social conservative political activist groups, makes it sort of hard for me to believe that any of these, I shouldn't say any, but that any substantial number of them are actually working for the CIA. I realized that there was a lot of interesting information you did in that interview you did, and one of the things that surprised me is the amazing number of biographical details that connect people. Like I think he mentioned. Did he mention Tim LaHaye?
Yes, he did.
Now Tim LaHaye, I think, was one of the founders of CNP. A real sort of, I don't know if fundamentalist is exactly the word, but not the sort of people that a Gene Kirkpatrick or a Republican power brokers would want to hang out with. So I think the founding of CNP was largely as far as I can tell, anyway, instigated by people from, very broadly speaking, the religious right. Now, your friend John Adams got into, people, he listed a whole series of people that had, at some point in their career, had a connection to the CIA or some similar organization. And after I listened to that, it was a very interesting and provocative interview, lots of information. But again, I've never connected the dots that way, and I'm not sure one has to. And I think it doesn't resonate with the sort of psychology of the people that I've encountered. And after that interview, I thought, well, let me look at my background, and I was aware that, I'm from a WASP background, and my father's family, was well connected. My father, grandfather, and great uncle went to Harvard after going to the same boarding school. My great uncle had a seat on the New York Stock Exchange, and then I was going back into family history, which was after listening to that, because I was thinking to myself, someone could look at my family background and even some things in my own biography, my resume, and say, well, maybe he's part of the Eastern WASP establishment, that he could be even Illuminati. And it was sort of funny because the more I dug, the more I found, immediate family members going back at least 100 years, and that's where I just stopped. It was sort of something I did for a couple of hours on the internet. Some of it I knew, but I thought, wow, I could actually write myself up as, for example, my father's mother, so my paternal grandmother, her grandfather was a friend of Carnegie, Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate, and it might have been the same. It might have been her father or grandfather was on the Supreme Court of New Jersey. And I was digging these things up, and I thought, well, I could do this. I could paint myself as one of these people that are, it's fun to talk about, but I'm not, and I don't have anything in common with that world except that, there were these connections. And then I briefly worked at MITRE Corporation, which you know MITRE Corporation here in Massachusetts, which does this was years ago, some kind of consulting, mainly for the Air Force, I guess, and TRW. So, these are things that are like not even on my resume because they're so minor, but someone could put together those sort of bullet points on loads and loads of people, especially if you're from an East Coast, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant background. Obviously, your family got here 300 or 400 years ago, and you're going to find loads of people, if you start getting into genealogy, who had some kind of political or economic power, or were connected to people who did. And so when John Adams was sort of listing these resume, the factoids about people in the evangelical world, I thought, well, I wouldn't have expected all that, but does it really mean what he says, what he thinks it means?
Yeah, obviously. I too have elements of my background that one could do. Make these connections and draw an inference if they wanted to, like employment. Because I live in the Washington D.C. area, the surrounding area, and often if you work in this area, you work for an intelligence or defense contractor at some point or another, and it doesn't necessarily mean you're a CIA. That's the, and that, there are too many accusations flying about, in the alternative media about people being shilled. No doubt there are shills, and there's infiltration, there's cognitive infiltration, and just the mere fact that term is used actually it's evidence of cognitive infiltration, because you're sowing division and you're creating suspicion. That's psychological warfare, just that term itself. Even the term conspiracy theory was a product of a conspiracy, and that's admitted by the CIA in their memorandum in 1967 to marginalize those people who were vocally criticizing the report on the JFK assassination, the Warren report. So they wanted to discredit these people, which, by the way, is a violation of the CIA's charter. But that's a whole other story. But manipulating the media. But when you're talking about functions of of the intelligence agencies and the interests that they represent. There's no formal CIA, may not be a formal CIA operation or code name or documents and these things. However, people who have done the research have produced pay vouchers and records of particularly financial reports which exposed MK Ultra. And of course, in the 1970s, we were although I think it was a limited hangout, very much so. We were the public got word of Mockingbird, the manipulation of the American press and media, and I think it goes much deeper than that. Is Hollywood coordinating with the CIA in terms of making movies that were, I guess, congenial to the interests that the CIA represents, and that's become formalized now with the liaison office between CIA and Hollywood, and of course the Defense Department or War Department's relationship with Hollywood goes back as far back as right after World War I or before World War I, using celebrity movie stars for bond drives and such, but even the creation of movies and these things. And of course the British were very heavily involved in Hollywood in the late 30s and 40s with the Quarter Circle, manipulating movies and culture and the messages in those movies. The Disney Corporation was taken over by the War Department throughout the entire Second World War, and they never quite left it. So, I mean, this type of media, this type of manipulation.
But then, how do you get? Yeah, let me. If I could just say, I believe, for example, MK Ultra is a real thing, and that I think I mentioned in an email to you that I have a friend who was close to one of the scientists who worked on that program. Mm-hmm. So I believe the MK Ultra thing, the Mockingbird stuff, the control of media. By someone. I mean, the CIA seems as good a candidate for anybody. I believe that. So there are obviously powers behind the media, behind the government, and in some ways behind the universities that we don't really know much about. And they do probably almost entirely only detrimental things. Mm-hmm. I don't question that at all. I think that one of my concerns is when we look at what's happening to the world and to our society, if we focus entirely on the deep state and these multi-thousand-year-old conspiracies, what we fail to do is see what our part in it is. And one of the things I liked about the interview that you just did with Joe Atwill on gender inversion, mm-hmm. And family and marriage is toward the end of that interview. There was mainly Joe was basically saying to people, if you want to have a workable family, a workable marriage, you've got to look at yourself and you've got to face what you're up against. And most of what you're up against, I think he said, is yourself. And that's kind of how I think people ought to look at what's going on with, the church world, the political world, family and stuff. All of these things, there has been a concerted effort to destroy the family, to destroy gender. There's no question about it, and I actually know some things that would make a lot of people wouldn't want to know, but the fact is it's worked rather well. And how could that happen unless we've allowed it, and some part of us wanted it to work? I mean, if someone is selling crystal meth on your street, and you become a crystal meth addict, it's because you decided to take the crystal meth, mm-hmm. right?
Yes.
So I think that we need to try to figure out why we're so vulnerable to, we can't control election fraud, people cheating on the ballot boxes or the voting machines. We can't control, we can't do anything about what's going on in the banking system and things like that. But in terms of the level that you guys were talking about in that interview, you and Joe Atwill, we do have something to say about how we think and act ourselves. And if we are gender confused, and I think our society basically is generally gender confused, we don't resemble Americans of 100 years ago. Our marriages don't resemble them. Our attitudes about the role of husband and wife, mother and father, where the mother should be when there are children, should she be out in a career, should she be at home, we don't resemble our grandparents and great-grandparents. So we've got to take some blame for that. And when we look at what's wrong with our churches, I think it's much more productive, or our educational institutions, I think it's much more productive, Tim, for us to figure out in what way are we voting with our feet. and making this happen while we complain about it and blame people far away that we, when we're taking their crystal meth. See?
Yeah, I know. You don't want to absolve people of personal responsibility and say they don't have free will, but you do have to acknowledge coercion when it exists and high level malfeasance, and that's when you have to address things like the culture creators, whether it's Hollywood and the malevolent forces that control the cinema, and the fact that it is organized, and as Joe Atwell says, it's not a cesspool, it's a weapon. And that implies intent, willful intent, malicious intent. And I think raising consciousness about the malevolence is a part, and once you raise the consciousness, then you can you can strengthen the free will. Because then once people are aware of it, if you expose the psychological warfare, it blunts it. It blunts it as a weapon. And so I understand what you're saying, but nevertheless, is when you have examples of high-level malevolence being conducted through the foundations, through the publishing houses like Time Life, coordinating with Hollywood to produce certain types of movies to alter the culture for malevolent reasons, we have to point that out, especially when it comes, because one thing when you, well, here, back to the CNP, gives them, when you're talking about something like the CNP being an intelligence asset, and how this might be an example of the powers that be wanting to control the debate, keeping within a certain arena so they can control it. And evidence for that is something that is, a prominent member of the CNP is Richard Viguerie, who is this, king, this Grand Poobah of direct mail. Well, his connection, part of his success can be explained by his links to the intelligence community and his role in that. And I'm just saying can be, because there's some evidence that, in the 1980s, he got in some financial problems and he was bailed out by by the South Korean CIA. They bought his building for like $10 million or something over market value. And, well, he played an important role in mobilizing the conservative movement behind things like Iran-Contra. And if you look at Iran-Contra wasn't just a scheme to fund anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua. That was the cover. It was a huge operation to fund an illegal arms shipping and drug shipping operation, shipping arms into Central America, stealing them from NATO storehouses. Oliver North was doing that. He was stripping our defenses in Europe to smuggle these weapons. This also involved the Israelis, and of course, then it also it involved the shipment of cocaine into places like Mena, Arkansas, and the Clintons, and this ties the Clintons in with the Bushes. So this betrays the entire fraud of the American political system of Republican versus Democrat. And a lot of the cocaine found its way into South Central L.A., which is exposed by Gary Webb in the Dark Alliance series, which then the CIA worked, and we know this now, to destroy his career for exposing this thing. And so, it's pretty bad. And so you have this...
To destroy whose career?
Gary Webb's. Worked for the San Jose Mercury News. And he was run out of the business for being a reporter. And the Washington Post, did this. And also, of course, at the same time, you have the South Korean CIA working through the Unification Church to fund things like the Washington Times. So this is all... Again, this is all, they're controlling both sides here. And, of course, the Washington Post has long been exposed as an organ of the CIA. Katharine Graham, Donald Graham, just the connections are all part of the George... And this all relates to the Georgetown set. Again, we're talking about a milieu of people of... they screw each other, they marry each other, they party together, they have the same interests, the same outlook. And doesn't necessarily have to be a conspiracy, it's just how they view the world. And all this is justified. And this is all part of that, that... The milieu of, you call it the WASP establishment. Plenty of Catholics want to join it. That's part of the problem. In D.C. is Catholics wanting political power in the United States. It's difficult to do that and stay being a Catholic. But that's my point is, and so you have this, that I think the story of someone like, Richard Viguerie is a great example of, well, the evidence is very suggestive. That his role was to more mobilize conservative cover for this illegal operation that involved Colonel North and the Bushes out of the National Security Council during the Reagan administration. And again, there's no direct memorandum or anything saying CIA working with the Clintons, but it was all there. And it was done, And the same way that we have evidence of in the 80s with early 80s when the Attorney General of the United States, William Finch Smith, signed a memorandum of understanding with the CIA that there would be no legal consequences for CIA officers not reporting drug smuggling. And this was the run-up to the dirty war in Central America. And, of course, in the 80s at the time, I thought is the Reagan administration was fighting the expansion of communism in Latin America. And it turns out that the whole thing was just a fraud.
Yeah.
Planting false stories about Soviet MiGs showing up in Nicaragua, these things. And the newspapers are doing, it's all being coordinated. So
at the meta level, or just looking at an end game, you've done some very interesting, provocative interviews with a whole variety of people. And one of the questions that comes to my mind each time I listen to one, and other people doing somewhat similar stuff out there. The question that keeps coming to my mind is, okay, what if you could push a button and drain the swamp, or eliminate the New World Order, the Illuminati, the CFR, just whoever at the CFR is at the center of their, sinister operations. What if you could just tomorrow have all those people gone out of Hollywood, out of Washington, out of the state capitals? Where would that leave us? How much of a difference would it make in our society if all of those operations suddenly, were divinely extinguished? Let's put it that way. Where would that leave the rest of us?
Well, this is part of the trap of the current system. I think it was. I think most people have no idea how the current banking system, the current economy, is based on things like, like the international narcotics trade, and perhaps this is how they justify it. It's almost like, do you remember the movie 3 Days of the Condor?
I remember the title. With
Robert Redford. There's a scene in it. Cliff Robertson plays the CIA, his handler, the typical nihilistic, cynical CIA, justifying everything. And at the end, more naively, is Robert Redford's going to go to the New York Times to publish a story that's going to break the story. If you believe the New York Times, is a real journalistic endeavor, going to do that. But for the sake of the movie, he's threatening to go to the Washington Times to the story. I mean, the New York Times, rather. I'm sorry. And Cliff Robinson says, "You do that, you realize what you're going to do." And he goes, "What?" And he says, "Well, first of all," and it's funny because the scandal was there was a CIA plot. There was a member of the CIA who had devised a plan to provoke a war in the Middle East to give the U.S. a pretext to go in and invade Saudi Arabia, I believe, in the story. This is, I think, around 1975, they're doing this. And it's kind of funny because Richard Helms, actually, the former CIA director, consulted on the film. I think Sidney Pollack was. No, I don't think Sidney Pollack was the director of that. But anyway, they're on the street there, and he goes, we have to do. I'm paraphrasing now. He says, "We have to do this. Why? What's going to happen when people go hungry and their children are cold? They're really hungry and they're cold. They're going to want us to do this. They're going to want us to do this. And you think when people are really hungry and they have no food and have no heat, they're going to want us to go and invade and play these dirty games." Now, what I'm saying is the presumption is that American prosperity, the American economy, the American way of life, is based ultimately on theft and murder. And the idea is to turn don't look at it, let the bad guys do what they have to do to keep the game going. Well, that's not true. That's not true at all, actually. The world would be a lot wealthier, if we didn't engage in these things. In fact, if people were allowed to reach their full potential throughout the world and real honest trade and friendship existed, and we didn't go out and stage coups so we could get assets on the cheap for the benefit of ExxonMobil, United Fruit Company, whatever. Now, what I'm saying, my point is, a long way to getting around to it is that if we suddenly ended the game, there'd be a immediate consequences because the system would collapse because it's based on graft and corruption.
So when you say it's not true, just to be precise, Tim, what you're saying is not true is that in the end it works out better for us. But I think you are, if I understand, you are saying, oh yeah, sure, it's true that our economy and our society is based on fundamental corruptions,
yes,
right?
Yes.
Okay. But you're saying what's not true is that it has to be that way.
No, because it doesn't have to be that way, because a small group of people had set up a system that benefits them directly, and the American people get a few crumbs, and that's called prosperity. And I think now less people are getting their beak wet, so there's more anxiety now than before. And the American economy is fundamentally unsound, but it's based on it's based on bond fraud and inflation and currency manipulation and the threat of war and the Pentagon to back up the U.S. dollar ultimately. Catherine Austin Fitts gives a talk. She is a former assistant director of HUD, and her story at HUD and the corruption she exposed there, the black budget and the money the trillions of dollars that have been stolen to do God knows what. But she gives a story. She has a speech where it's called the Red Pill speech. And she's in front of 150, 200 God-fearing Christians, as she describes them. And she explains how the role narcotics plays in funding Wall Street, keeping the banks solvent, ultimately keeping their pension checks going, and keeping their 401ks inflated so they can have the illusion of wealth and prosperity. And she says, if I could get rid of drugs, get drugs off the street right now, shut down the drug trade, and by pressing this red button, but it would cause your 401k to drop by 75%, and maybe your pension checks to be cut or stopped. Would you support it? And she says, out of 150 people, 2 raised their hand.
Yeah, I think she said. I've heard this. I think she said 1.
Maybe one. Maybe I'm being more optimistic.
But this is exactly that's exactly my point.
Yeah.
In a way, ironically, as much as I respect Catherine Austin Fitts, it's a sort of a contradiction of her eternal optimism about the American people. How can you tell that story and be as optimistic as she is?
Yes.
Now, and that's really what I was asking when I said, okay, if you could push a button and remove all of these, black ops at the CIA and whatever's going on that's diabolical at CFR and everywhere else in the bank and on Wall Street, what would we be left with? What would we have to look in the mirror at if all that were gone? And when you break down what Catherine Austin Fitts was saying in that story, what she was saying is the American people are not just whores. They're willing to have other people die in large numbers, live in poverty, or spend their lives in prison, often in many cases, as she explained it, young black males, being rounded up off the streets. There's a whole, it would take a long time to go into what she was describing. But she said, people, I'm talking about people who are attracted to her services as a professional and her character and personality, which, has got to be a pretty good selection of people, right? And yet, looking her in the eye, they had to say, no, we'd like the system to continue sacrificing large numbers of young people in our communities. That's what people want. Now, what this means is, in a sense, not to reduce it to a cliche, but don't we have the conspiracy we deserve? Aren't we the conspiracy? Isn't it sort of God's way of saying, well, I've warned you, I've told you, if you aren't going to be my children, you're going to be someone else's children, and we know who that is. So you're going to live with the consequences. And I don't think that there's, I look at people in the world of evangelical churches and social activism, people that 20 years ago I thought were the salt of the earth, the last American heroes, American pastors and pro-life activists and whatever. I got to know these people and I think, well, wow, yuck. And not every single one of them, but overwhelmingly. The males are emasculated. The women are pushy and demanding. They're not people who have a biblical or Christian character type that they pretend to in church or whatever. There's something so wrong with our general population that we can't do anything but keep buying the crack that's being put out there.
Well, there's been a alchemical process that's been formed against the American people for the better part of 60 years. In my other interviews, I've covered at least how that was done, and I mean there is a conspiracy there to the extent that there was social engineering being carried out, by the great foundations to promote certain memes and ideas in the media, certain figures, certain change agents, whether it's Allen Ginsberg, Gloria Steinem, Hugh Hefner, even William F. Buckley. And these were figures there.
Yeah, Alfred Kinsey and
Alfred Kinsey, Time Magazine. That was the Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation. These things, and this gets into that broader issue. Of, you talked about it with Thomas, sort of the culture war aspect of this and what's occurred, and again how the sort of the internalization. We've internalized these bad ideas, but largely because it's been these supposed radical ideas had the support of the corporate power structure, and that's supposed to be conservative. So that's.
See, I think that my approach is more psychological and spiritual than. I think the things that happen in the political and economic world are outworkings or manifestations of things that are, well, your title of your program is Powers and Principalities. Mm-hmm. So we know where that comes from. It's a biblical expression. I think that what we're seeing in terms of the disgendering of America, the destruction of the family, the crass materialism, the willingness to have other people have their lives destroyed, and it doesn't impact us as far as we're concerned. This is basically at the nature of fallen man. Mm-hmm. It's not something you have to be taught. It's something you don't have to be poisoned to be like that. You have to have something lift you out of that condition. That's the Christian view, right? Mm-hmm. That unless something spectacular, miraculous happens to you or to your society, it's going to be corrupt and violent, unjust. There are going to be all kinds of conspiracies and mafias, and it's going to be systemic oppression of various types, unless something prevents it from being that way. That's the default. The default condition that we should expect is a dysfunctional society with lots of people being essentially sacrificed to Baal.
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. And the abortion thing is just one example. There are powers and principalities that want blood, and it's hardwired into us as fallen creatures to collaborate in that system. It wasn't that hard for the Bolsheviks to get tens of millions of Russians and other citizens of what became the Soviet Union to go along. It wasn't hard for the Nazis. It wasn't hard for Chairman Mao. It's not that hard to get people to do this stuff.
That's true, but again, all those events, whether it's the rise of the Third Reich, Chairman Mao in China, even the Bolsheviks, all had very important funding from London and Wall Street.
Fair enough.
I mean, the culture, it moves on its own, but it can be pushed fairly easily, especially if you have a financed, well-organized power elite, an elite that's dedicated to the degradation and weakening of society, as opposed to its edification and improvement. And we have a hostile elite, and you have to identify that, because part of it goes back to my point of part of sort of appealing to our own free will, our own inner strength, is also acknowledging our enemies. Christ told us to love our enemies, but not deny that we have them. And we also were told to be as clever as serpents and as gentle as as lambs. I think it goes. So, but there is organized malevolence, and there's examples of specific institutions and individuals being paid money, organizing to do things. And the great example, I just recently did a show with Joe talking about the foundations and how the foundations are an instrument for this stuff. And one of the things that the foundations were used for was to create the culture war. The culture was also created by things like the Vietnam War. Wars are a great social engineering endeavor. And there's no better way. And that the foundations themselves admitted back in, this is what Catherine Casey, during the investigator for the Carol Reese Committee, she was sent up to in New York in the 1950s to read the minutes of the Carnegie Corporation. And when she came back, she had a nervous breakdown. What she found out was these foundations, the Carnegie Foundation, had determined that the most effective way to fundamentally alter American life and bring it towards collectivism. Also, the plan was to merge it with the Soviet Union. There was a later plan in the 30s and 40s. Was war. And lo and behold, this was 1909, 1910 that these minutes were being... In the next 30 years, America found itself... In fact, the next 30 years, if you count Korea and Vietnam, the next 70 years, America found itself constantly at war. And it fundamentally changed American society. World War I and World War II. E. Michael Jones has done fabulous research regarding the weaponization of civil rights and the integration of the urban neighborhoods to break up the ethnic neighborhoods so they could weaken the power of the Catholic Church in mid-century America, because the WASP establishment was very suspicious of Catholic power. And they wrote about it, like Paul Blanchard wrote about Catholic power and American freedom. And the idea was that the Catholics were too numerous, they didn't practice birth control, and that needed to change. And one way you achieve that was to break up the neighborhoods and create suburbia. And suburbia wasn't a market process, that was social engineering, the interstate highway system and these things. And this was done to change the demographics, to change the culture, because much of the upheaval we had in the 60s, the sexual revolution, simply would have been possible with America, with its demographics in the 1930s or 40s. And what was shocking to me is just how people had planned this out. It wasn't just history unfolding in these things. So you do have malevolent forces. A good example is sex education. And that was done. You mentioned how Planned Parenthood, in 1969, planned this all out. And
well, it wasn't. You mean that other interview? It wasn't Planned Parenthood. Actually, this is the woman that I mentioned to Thomas Henry Horan that I suggested. I would recommend you interview. It's her name is Erin Busy. She's in Britain, and she was a feminist, and she personally participated in a meeting in Washington in 1969 of British and American feminists, maybe Canadian and I don't know, French, German. They tended to be mainly the wives of prominent Marxist men, and they laid out essentially what Western society was going to turn into as regards family, marriage, and gender. And it was laid out, as she described it, essentially as a conspiracy to destroy society. And to redefine the family as, put it ironically, a Madonna and child, or Madonna and children, mother and children. And whereas historically in the biblical scheme of the family and society, the father, the family belongs to the father, the children are his seed. Legally, in fact, in Western law, the children and the wife were the property of the father in a certain sense. And in fact, there was you mentioned the WASP conspiracy against the Catholics, and probably in the eastern cities, Maine. I'm sure that's true. But there was a decision a little over 100 years ago in Minnesota called the Flint decision, in which the Catholic Church played a role in overturning. They advocated for a Catholic woman who had married either an apostate or an atheist man. They had children, and then the marriage was going to break up. And legally, under the rules at the time, the children would have gone with their father, which would have been, regardless of the fact that he was a pagan or whatever, or at least not Catholic, whatever, was the law and the way things functioned in Western civilization. Now, the decision overturned, and it was a landmark decision, and that's one of the sort of pivotal points in the march of feminism. If you can look in the upper Midwest, you can see it's sort of ironic collaboration of the Catholic Church, but I think especially Protestants from Scandinavia, Finland, and mostly the Protestant immigrants from Northern Europe who came with, especially from Scandinavia, sort of socialist and other left-wing progressive ideas. And they created this Midwestern kind of flirtation with the left, which still exists in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Kansas, all those areas. These things go back before the 20th century, well before. They go back, in some ways, prior to the Civil War. Feminism was already trying to piggyback on the anti-slavery battle, and the long-term vision of some of these women was to destroy the family. I mean, Susan B. Anthony was probably in a lesbian relationship with her best friend. I'm trying to remember her name. Almost equally well-known feminist. It was all undercover, and she played the good cop, and the other woman was the more radical. This stuff goes back well before, even before the Civil War.
That's Stanton?
Yes, Stanton.
Okay.
Edith
Canton Stanton or Kathy Stanton?
Yeah. Kate, I think Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton, yeah.
Yeah, they probably had a lesbian relationship. You look at the letters between them; it's pretty sticky. So this stuff goes back, and in fact, I think I'm one of those people who believes that some of these tendencies arose out of Protestantism. You may like hearing that, and the gentleman you just mentioned that you've interviewed?
E. Michael Jones?
Yeah, and he might like to hear this as well. I think some of these tendencies did come out of, ultimately, out of consequences of the individualism and egalitarianism of Protestantism. I see that as someone with, a 500-year pedigree of Protestantism. But some of the other tendencies, I think, came out of Catholicism. And it kind of became a toxic soup here in certain ways.
Mm-hmm. Well, also remember, this is also added the Catholicism in America, which was Americanism, and the Catholic Church in America was subsumed by Americanism, particularly in the 20th century. So it's one of these things where the idea of the it goes back to the liberalism itself, which the syllabus of errors written by the Pope in the 1860s, and some of the problems of liberalism itself, the internal contradictions of liberalism. What we're experiencing now, some people say, is the sort of the reductio ad absurdum of liberalism itself. The nonsense where the gender confusion, these things, the extremist individualist claims which deny basic identity like sex identity, which ultimately denies you. It destroys the only, the most found basic identity is what sex you are, one or the other. Mm-hmm. And now we're living in an age of so much flux and confusion that's up for debate. But I think, as you point out, this isn't necessarily something. This isn't sort of like a law of entropy. Things fall apart. This stuff is being created. This discord and confusion is being purposely created. Like you say, this meeting in 1969. Well, not as if these people had a pulse on the course of history. They could read history scientifically, like a Marxist could. They claimed to have some sort of scientific read of history. Is obviously they were being supported, connected by important powers. And that same year, in 1969, you had something here, a conference, the Jaffe Memo, that the U.S. government had commissioned with Planned Parenthood to do a very same thing here in the United States. It was to promote feminism, to weaken the family, weaken the role of the father, promote homosexuality in these things. This is why you had all
this came from where? What was the memo?
The Jaffe Memo, 1969. Okay. And this was commissioned by the U.S. government. A while back, I interviewed Dr. Nancy Banks, and she wrote a book about, it's a book about a whole lot of things. But AIDS, Africa, and diamonds, about. Well, she in the book, she's very critical and analyzes the AIDS myth, the HIV basis for AIDS, and these things. And she has a very interesting theory, I think convincing. Other people do, like Duisberg and all that, about the myth of HIV. But the social engineering aspect of the AIDS crisis under the pretext of age education and saving children's lives, because they might get HIV if they engage in unsafe sex. The National Research Council, Rockefeller-funded, working with the Russell Sage Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation, put together a sex ed program, I think through the U.S. Public Health Service, that would be instituted through the public schools. This is the 1980s. And to introduce very graphic sex ed programs to students under the pretext of protecting them, from the AIDS epidemic that was supposedly going to break out. And the documents pretty much exposed a plan that it wasn't so much they were about AIDS, is that the AIDS hysteria created by the U.S. government was used as a pretext to introduce a sex ed program that was very graphic to middle schoolers and these things that parents would otherwise oppose. But they created the AIDS hysteria, and these things were justified, and it was there not so much to protect the kids' health. It was there, and this is in the documents, is to fundamentally change their mores and attitude towards sex. And
Yeah, there's no question. There have been these schemes, conspiracies, whatever you want to call them. They go back quite a ways. I don't know how far back. I mean, I now increasingly believe that the signing of the Declaration of Independence was, if not exactly a Masonic conspiracy, certainly not what we've been told it was. Have you ever interviewed James Perloff?
Yes, I have. We've talked about that.
Okay.
Yeah, but the whole the shot heard around the world and all.
Yeah. Now, where did the phrase you use the phrase Americanism? Who's influenced you mainly on that? Is it E. Michael Jones?
E. Michael Jones, and also there is a book written by David Wemhoff that I read, and I interviewed him. John Courtney Murray, Time, Life, and the American Proposition.
Wait, what's David who?
David Wemhoff.
Okay.
And the book is I'm looking at it right now. John Courtney Murray, Time, Life, and the American Proposition: How the CIA's doctrinal warfare program changed the Catholic Church. And what happened was the church was seen in the post-war era as a potential stumbling block to the Cold War agenda of the CIA. And what happened was they used the threat of communism to more or less get the Catholic Church on their side in the Cold War. And what happened was they developed a plan not so much to oppose the Catholic Church, to weaken the Catholic Church, but to infiltrate it, because it had offices throughout the world. There's a church in every parish and these things. And so if they infiltrate the Catholic Church and get it on their side, then the church becomes a useful weapon in the Cold War. At the same time, you had the efforts of...
Yeah, but hold on. That's to infiltrate the Catholic Church with a celibate clergy, where you're presumed to be joining the clergy to the priesthood to do this for the rest of your life. How does the CIA infiltrate an organization like that?
Well, not necessarily the CIA. It's also operating through outfits like B'nai B'rith. It's not just CIA. Again, when we're talking about CIA, we're not talking about CIA proper, Langley.
But no, this is an important point. But the infiltration of the Catholic Church per se.
It was intellectual. Okay. It was John Courtney Murray had written a book called The American Proposition. We hold these truths, I think, was the speech he gave. And one thing characters like Claire Booth Luce, who had converted to Catholicism, but she's married to Henry Luce, who was an old skull and boneser, Time, Life. And remember, when you
so the infiltration of the Catholic Church was basically at the major Catholic universities.
Yeah, definitely. If you look at what happened at Notre Dame with Hesburgh and the Land O'Lakes Conference, and how that was alienated from the church, and they handed over to lay authority, which really was the Rockefellers, and also the Catholic University, where you had the confrontation in 1967 regarding birth control and the reaction to Humanae Vitae, and the whole controversy with what's that professor there? I forget his name. But it was the whole media campaign, because this also factors in Vatican II. What happened in Vatican II was the American press, particularly Time, Life, they controlled the interpretation of Vatican II. The myth of liberalization, and some would argue that Vatican II itself was rotten from the get-go. So there's a spirit of Vatican II, and there's a letter of Vatican II. People who defend Vatican II say you have to interpret Vatican II in light of tradition. But the problem is the mass media isn't going to do that. They're not going to interpret Vatican II in the light of tradition. They're going to interpret it in a way that's going to subvert Catholic authority. And you have
All right, so here, let me. The couple of questions are raised by this, all this stuff. What would had the CIA? Okay, the CIA is a finite organization, far smaller than the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm.
You'd have to ask, what kind of resources would it take, even if you go strategically to, Notre Dame and Boston College and Georgetown, and let's say you pick 10, and I mean, it's how many decades and what kind of resources would it take? So
well, you have to look at it in the context of the times. This is 1945.
Mm-hmm.
America has conquered the world, more or less. They won World War II, defeated fascism. It's holding back the tide of communism, which was a consequence of World War II, and we're not going to get into that. But anyway, what happens, you have to look at the American Catholic Church itself at the time. The bishops, and they saw themselves as Americans first and not Catholics. Okay? So what happened was that the ideology of America, liberalism, took precedent over Catholic doctrine. One thing is this critical idea of the separation of church and state. Okay? Now, America is a proposition nation. America itself doesn't have a religion to bind it. It has many different faiths. I'd argue that the fact that America prior to the second half of the 20th century was very decentralized. And so the fact that it was sort of a polyglot civilization, its decentralization sort of ameliorated that. It became more of a problem when it became centralized after the New Deal. Well, you could say after the Civil War, really, but after the New Deal, really, concentrated power in Washington, D.C. and these things. And of course, World War II just accelerated that process. Let
me ask you about the bishops seeing themselves as Americans
mm-hmm.
rather than as Catholics or Christians. What could that have been avoided? And if so, what caused it? And I mean, if you have millions of Catholics,
it has something to do with Catholics wanting to be successful Americans, wanting to climb the grease pole of America, wiggle up the grease pole of American power, be accepted. Right. Claire Ruth Luce there's a quote in there. She says that to finally sit at the table, to have a place at the establishment. Well, the problem is, given the true nature of America, the American experiment, and its Freemasonic origins, as you alluded to earlier, maybe there isn't a place for Catholics at the table. Their job is not to be at the table. And in order to be at the table, you have to sell your soul to one degree or another. And that's what many remember. Also, what you also have with Catholics is, particularly with Irish Catholics, is a sort of inferiority complex. You have these lace curtain Catholics who always figure they're not as smart, not as successful as their WASP betters. There's also the Jewish component with Hollywood, which is very important. The Jewish fact here, but I think so. What happened was the American ideology became dominant after World War II, liberalism itself. And this was very important.
Well, hold on. When you say the American ideology, because when you first use the phrase Americanism,
mm-hmm.
I'm thinking of the Declaration of Independence, which is probably part of what you're saying, right?
Yeah, it's part of it.
Okay, so then, by the way, I want to back up, because you said something fascinating that I really agree with. At least I would apply it more broadly to anyone who's going to be a genuine Christian. There is not a place at the table in this society. There isn't in
mm-hmm.
modern Germany, in modern Sweden, Britain. There just isn't. And when I look at something like the CNP or the evangelical churches or the pro-life organizations or so-called pro-family organizations, what I see is an ethos manifests in the personalities of the people who I once thought of as American
mm-hmm.
heroes. Who are so materialistic, so conformed to a sort of tidier version of the American sleaziness that we're talking about. It's sort of a cleaned up version, just like Mormons present themselves as clean cut, always dressed in a shirt and tie or whatever. That's what I think evangelicalism has become. And there is this, ultimately the ultimate value, I should say, in American religion today for, I'd say, 98% of the people and clergy is, what's my lifestyle going to be?
Yes.
It's not about Christ. It's not about, and so I think that Christians no longer have a place at the table in this country. We don't have a place at the big corporations, at the big banks, and the courts. We are now experiencing the curses that Moses prophesied upon Israel at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, because exactly what you described, wanting to climb the greasy pole and selling your soul in the process. Now, was there a way that could not have happened?
Given what America is sort of a Freemasonic Frankenstein monster. It is what it is, right? I think if they maintain their Catholic identity, and a lot of it is it's the what you talk about, it's mammon, right? It's the worship of money, and
it's mammon, but it's also social conformity.
Yeah, the Catholic Church prospered materially in America, and the bishops themselves became what they call brick and mortar men. Okay, they wanted to build their schools. They wanted to build their churches and their parishes and these things, and all that's very important. You need an infrastructure, but because of that, they kind of lost their pastoral responsibilities, and they sort of this is how it kind of works structured, at least how I read it, and so they kind of passed that on responsibility on to the theologians, who became more liberal. And again, you can't take this out of the context of what was going on at the time. This was the late 1940s.
Are you saying the priests passed on their pastoral duties to the theologians?
Well, the idea of controlling the doctrine, how people were educated.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And you can see that mostly. A great example is what happened at Catholic University when John Cardinal Kroll tried to fire Charles, what's his name, the Curran, and he came out openly opposed to Humanae Vitae, the Pope. Pius VI encyclical on birth control in 1968. And they fired him. And then this huge protest was mobilized. And, of course, the media, which was obviously opposed to the traditional interpretation by the Catholic Church, played Charles Curran to be a hero. They could have just – the thing is, they didn't fire him. He didn't have tenure, and his contract expired, so they didn't renew it. And so they just let it lapse. And then there was huge protest, and they backed down, and they gave him tenure. They lost control of Catholic University. They lost control of Notre Dame. That was Hesburgh did that when he handed it over to the lay authority on the Delano Lakes Conference. And this is all also in the context of Vatican II and these things. And so what happened was, when I'm talking about the American ideology, internationally, you had confessional states like Italy and Spain that the American Catholic Church, American bishops, abandoned Franco because Franco was illiberal. He was a dictator. But Spain was a Catholic country, with this church had special privileges, and Spain was Catholic and Catholicism was Spain. It was just all part of the culture. But in the aftermath of the Second World War, this was against the American ideology of separation of church and state. It was considered illiberal. And so, Franco lingered on until 1975, and when he died, they adopted a liberal constitution. And look at Spain now. They have gay rights and these things, and
it's a disaster.
The disaster. The economy isn't even doing well. They said the economy would do better because Franco would, protected the economy from globalism. He had a protectionist economy. But then they opened the economy, and it's worse now than it was under Franco. And now the culture is in utter decline. They're well below replacement level in birth rates, and the country is completely demoralized because it lost its Catholic identity.
Well,
the same thing happened to Italy.
Taking the widening the focus or taking a longer historical perspective, I think you'd have to acknowledge that certainly a non-Catholic is going to object. For example, I think some of the perspective I've heard from E. Michael Jones, whom I enjoy listening to, and he's got a lot of great things to say. But when you look at the way confessional states were, Spain, Italy, Ireland, we're talking about Catholic chiefly at the moment, the problems were pretty severe. There was in Ireland massive pedophile issue. I mean, when Catholics see, when I was a kid, a very small kid, my parents were for a while involved in a kind of a fundamentalist group here in Massachusetts, and they were down at having this meeting on the Boston Common, and some priest gave the Irish Catholic police instructions to have my parents and everyone they were with thrown into jail, which they did. And so, where are these guys thinking that they're Americans before Catholics? I was raised in an environment here in very, very liberal Brookline, Massachusetts, where just noticeably, on average, the Catholic kids were not only rougher, but there were not the moral values that you would associate with a good Catholic. It was just not that the Jewish or the WASP contingents in my school were anything to be very proud of, but people came from the Catholic countries with all kinds of issues to America. So in a way, it's not hard to understand why the English and Scots, and I guess there were some Germans and a few Swedes, but largely Protestants were here, why they would have been appalled at what they were seeing. Now, granted, the people who came, some of them had just suffered a famine from Ireland. They were oppressed by the English. Mm-hmm. But what I'm saying is, when you look at the confessional states, which were Roman Catholic, there were huge problems. The Catholic Church in places like southern Italy seemed to be in bed with the mafia. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not saying this to be, because I don't have a horse in this race. I believe, as I think I said in an email, I believe organized religion in America and in the West is essentially defunct. And that includes my own heritage. I'm glad that there are traditional Catholics rediscovering their faith, and in many cases actually developing more interest in the Bible than Catholics used to, because that wasn't typically associated with lay Catholics. Mm-hmm. I celebrate that. I celebrate most of what E. Michael Jones is saying, but I don't think it's very convincing to be too sentimental about what preceded the mess that we're in.
No, it doesn't say it was a paradise. There weren't problems. But I don't think liberalism is the answer. I think liberalism is oversold because we have a false liberalism here. We have elections that are universally corrupt. If you get into issues like black box voting, computerized voting, voter fraud is always, or not even voter fraud, it's actually just election fraud, because it's the people who count the votes that matters. And so even our democracy is a fraud.
I agree with you very much on all that.
We don't have courts that interpret the law based on the law. Courts have a cultural and social agenda that's congenial to the oligarchs. I mean, look at some of these decisions are just manifestly absurd, and I'm told I got to respect it because these idiots wear black robes. I can read words. The words have meaning. I know what it means. It's absurd, and so we don't have rule of law in the liberal societies. So again, what we're doing is we're pointing out all the problems of confessional states, ignoring all the horrible problems of liberal states.
Right.
And look, the mafia. I mean, it was the OSS. It was the fascist state of Italy, Mussolini, who suppressed the mafia. Then we liberate Italy, and we're working with the mafia.
Right.
The Luciano Project, and all that is aggravated because in the post-war era, the OSS and CIA is working with Luciano to bring heroin in from Turkey as a reward for his support during World War II as the Luciano Project. And of course, this continues on in Vietnam, Meyer Lansky, and why they build Las Vegas and these things. So the liberal societies, they'll go in and they'll support organized crime and these things, and then I don't think you can necessarily blame it on Southern Italian culture and these things. The corruption is there, and it probably would be there. But what I'm saying is that I would say, with America is another story. America is a unique situation, and I think Michael Jones would say that there's sort of a modus vivendi existed in the early part of the 20th century, particularly in the North. There's more of an issue in the North. The ethnic issue is when you have these ethnic enclaves that have their own sort of sovereignty. And and because of this, they had very high birth rates, and they managed to elect a president in 1960 who was Catholic, with the help of voter fraud. But that's an American tradition, isn't it? But let's face it. I mean, both sides cheated. It's a question of which side cheats, and in the end of the game, in the end of the final analysis, it really doesn't matter which party wins anyway, because the oligarchs control both parties. But nevertheless, he sees the sort of way America was situated with these urban neighborhoods, with these strong parishes and these things. This was an acceptable modus vivendi that the elite couldn't stand. A good example of sort of this, I think I mentioned this off call, but we're talking, getting back to the CNP sort of being controlled opposition, and this was what happened in the second half of the 20th century in America, during the Cold War, when the conservative movement was purged of the old right elements, the anti-imperialist elements, and it was put on board the imperial project, the Truman Project of the Cold War, with CIA operatives like William F. Buckley. And so basically, it was housebroken. It was the conservative movement was civilized. The conservative movement never presented a real threat to the liberal establishment. That was the idea. Well, in the run-up to the Second World War, because the United States was largely, it was still regional, and you had regional economic interest. The interest of the Midwest differed from, and they still do, interest of the Midwest different from the interest of Wall Street, the Eastern establishment. Manufacture, agriculture versus finance. And this was illustrated, or at least manifested, in the creation of the America First movement, when the Eastern establishment wanted to get America into yet another war to bail the British out. And this was, the Roosevelt administration working with British, committing treason, breaking the law with British intelligence agents. So a lot of movies made about Nazi fifth columnists, in the run-up to the World War II during the Second World War. But what about British fifth columnists? They were inside the White House and inside Rockefeller Center. William Stevenson, the man caught intrepid in these operations, operating in Hollywood. And, they could run circles around the Russians and the Germans in propaganda. But anyway, the Midwest, because it had its regionalism, its regional character with manufacture, you had the America First Committee, which I think represents the last genuine interest group that opposed the American empire, and subsequently was destroyed. And I think I mentioned how it was destroyed was the FBI went in to Henry Reagan's office and stole the mailing list from him. So it was gone. And then, of course, you had the alchemical effect of the Second World War, the sort of this militant collectivism for the war effort, and the psychological warfare that all that entailed, the propaganda. And you have the Cold War, you have Korea, and these things, and that fundamentally changed American society. And not to mention the concentration of power, and the further collectivization of America. Where after the 1950, you couldn't have a genuine opposition to the imperial project.
Do you ever, focus down where I do, where I prefer to mainly? I look at the big picture as you are, but I very much try to get it down like on a dot matrix, zoom in on an old photograph and see what is at the the microscopic level, or what is at the atomic level. When the, let's say, Notre Dame went leftist or liberal, mm-hmm. or kind of pseudo-Catholic and everything else, what's going on at the micro level when you have, at some stage, you have an overwhelming number of faculty, administrators, and students and alumni who are of the old school, for better or worse, okay? And they are gradually being displaced. Why aren't they resisting?
Because it's so gradual, and they're not organized, and they're not even conscious of it. I mean, I'm not. I mean, I'm a product of. I grew up in suburbia, and I wasn't even aware all this was happening until I actually read about it.
Well, but see, I think there's more to it than what you've just said, mm-hmm. because they do know there are faculty who know these things are happening.
Oh yeah, I see your point.
And they put their heads down,
which
is what people at CNP did, and people in churches do when kids are getting molested, or mm-hmm. when you have a priest who is gay or whatever. People put their heads down and don't want to make trouble.
It's unpleasant.
It's unpleasant, and if you're even if you have tenure at Notre Dame or whatever, what I'm saying is, nature abhors a vacuum, okay? Mm-hmm. And if you have a moral vacuum, yet let's say a Notre Dame, or pick any institution you want, an entire denomination or a CNP or whatever, you have with all sorts of well-intentioned people, but their intentions are not so. Their fealty to the good and to let's say to Christ, to their faith, whatever, is not so intense that they're willing to lose everything for it. Then of what good are they to God or to the institution that's ostensibly that belongs to God? If Christ told us, "I would that you were hot or cold, lukewarm I will vomit out of my mouth," that ought to have strategic value to us as we look at the level of analysis that I'm trying to get to right now. Notre Dame would be a perfect example. It's happened in all kinds of places. How does it function? It happens because people are very, very cowardly and selfish, and that's my general observation about conservatism. There are some, alpha males here and there, and even more offensively, some alpha females. But in general, conservatives just want a paycheck, a big screen TV, a couple of nice SUVs in the driveway. They want their stuff. Yeah. They want their toys. And that's not going to work. It's not going to work. And so, to me, Christ has explained to us, there are so many things like this in the Bible that have profound value to understanding social transformation, cultural degradation, so that there's not even that much of a need for a worldwide, a global conspiracy of extremely powerful bankers and intellectuals and whatever, that will come in and fill the vacuum. But the vacuum is already there. The vacuum is a kind of apostasy in the ultimate sense, which disguises itself as orthodoxy, and therefore becomes, in the biblical scheme, offensive to God, and therefore he pulls out. He says, "You're on your own." You see what I mean?
Yeah,
so much.
I mean, there are. I mean, of course, you have the analogy of the eye of the needle, right?
Yeah.
You have to, the idea, easier for a camel to get through the eye of the needle, the rich man to get into heaven. Of course, the eye of the needle was a gate in going to a city. Your camel had to unburden itself of its goods to get through. Then they put it back on, and so but there's also you have the story of Jesus Christ when he tells the rich man he must sell all his goods to join him, and that's the only way he can join him is to do this, and he won't do that, right? He can't do that. But then also you have characters like Joseph or Arimathea, who Christ never tells to sell. He was a wealthy man. Christ never tells him to sell his goods because he knows he's a wealthy man who can handle it. So, that it is possible, but there is. It's the.
See, what I'm saying is, what I try to provoke people with is that if you could wipe out all of these conspiracies of the left or the deep state or the banksters and all these people, if you could wipe them out, wouldn't we still be left with weak men and pushy women? That's really what we'd be left with. And that's not going to work. And part of the reason we're left there is we no longer have taboos that we enforce. I'm sure you'll agree with this.
Yes.
And one of the things that made divorce difficult, unfortunately it didn't always make adultery difficult, but it made divorce difficult, is the taboo, the stigma. Now, a woman can go into a family court anywhere in the Western world, and with a snap of a finger, she can take the father out of their lives and take the children out of their father's life, as if they belonged to her, but not to him. It's that easy. And nobody will stigmatize that woman. And then those children will suffer what's called parental alienation syndrome. They will be raised to be either to spit upon their father. The quote. Well, anyway.
But this creates gender confusion.
It creates that. It creates economic collapse. It creates an amoral generation of people. It creates narcissists.
Latchkey kids.
Yeah, but it creates narcissists. I mean, people who can't even conceive of their own moral responsibilities, because most of that comes from the father. Whatever people want to say about the value of a good mother, there are certain things that are metaphysically masculine in their relation to the other things that your mother can do for you. Mm-hmm. And the absence of the father, I mean, the Old Testament ends with the famous words, "I will send my servant Elijah, and he will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, or else I will send a curse of total destruction upon the land." Now, what we're seeing is total destruction, economic. Almost everybody in prison or jail didn't have much of a father, if at all.
Mm-hmm. Neither did Bill Clinton.
Right. Right. Well, hopefully he'll end up in jail. So, but what I'm saying is that if you could wipe out all these conspiracies, you would still be left with us.
So you don't believe in neutral parenting?
I think that we have fundamentally lost the concept of gender that I don't see a way back, honestly. That may sound very pessimistic. I think there's a ratchet effect in societies. You see it in biblical history. You can see it in the fall of Roman Empire. You can see it throughout history in societies. I think there's a ratchet effect. I think there's things that happen that you can't
but there are like examples of I would say that there's institutional changes which accelerated this intentionally. One thing is, the conservative governor Ronald Reagan signing California's no-fault divorce law. Right. And right after that, you have all these television shows about divorce. The Odd Couple, right? One day at a time.
Back before you don't even need conspiracies, though, as you I'm sure you realize. I'm not. You're obviously very, very well informed and highly intelligent, so I'm not condescending there. But you can go back to the fall of Rome, and even at the time of Christ, and he confronts the woman at the well, and he says, "Woman, where is your husband?" And then he tells her, I think she says, no, he says, "You have had 7 husbands, and the one you're with is not your husband." Well, he's basically saying you're a basket case.
Yeah.
And then you have St. Paul, and I think Peter, telling St. Paul twice says a woman shall not leave her husband while he is alive. And what you find out if you go back and look at the history is that already in the time of Christ and the apostles, marriage was disintegrating because of a form of feminism. Women were getting these legal rights, the empowerment to walk out of a marriage. Eventually, that's one of the things that destroyed the Roman Empire. And it happened, anyway, we can go into ancient history, but I doubt there was any conspiracy there. I think that's, like the second law of thermodynamics. Things wind down, and the nature of fallen man is to satisfy impulses.
That's true, but nevertheless, with the advent, I do think with technology, you can accelerate these things, if not start them. And that's, if you look at the Cultural War, something like pornography is not possible without photography or moving pictures. It's just, you have etchings, it isn't effective. It doesn't have the broad psychological warfare effect. There's a book by Christopher Simpson called The Science of Coercion. And it's pretty much just about how mass communication in the early to mid part of the 20th century was studied by the intelligence agencies in the United States, studied by the intelligence agencies and the War Department for the purposes of mass manipulation. Something like the Princeton Radio Project, the broadcast of Orson Welles' Halloween Eve broadcast of War of the Worlds was a test. It wasn't done accidentally. They wanted to create mass hysteria, and not only did they manipulate people with that broadcast, they also then exaggerated the hysteria it created to see what the reaction would be. And the interesting year was 1938, because this was the run-up to the Second World War. And the idea, they were very interested in the use of mass communication. And, of course, the use of cinema in these things, where anywhere from, the Bolsheviks used the cinema. Trotsky did that with his roving trains and films. Propaganda films like Battleship Potemkin and these things. The storming in the Winter Palace, which never occurred, by the way. It's only on film that it occurred. Or in Hollywood itself, it was immediately utilized. And it's sent for propaganda purposes. The creation of the movie star, I believe Edward Bernays came up with that idea. He came up with Enrico Caruso as a singing icon, the rock star, the idea of the celebrity to change
Bernays
society.
must have been very young at that time.
Yes, he was. He lived to be like 101 or something.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So this is when he's in his 20s, but of course he's the the nephew of Sigmund Freud.
Mm-hmm.
And so the weaponization of the use of psychology, weaponized psychology to manipulate the masses, and mass media, the radio. I mean, look at TV. Wow, that fundamentally changed how people communicate and how they seek out entertainment. It used to be a group event where you go outside and meet with people. Now, TV restricted it to the family. Now, with the internet, TV's an individual event. Entertainment is with iPods and these things. People are becoming increasingly itemized, and you're creating a bunch of borderline autistic people with some of this technology. Mm-hmm. Of course, this isn't to mention the toxic environment with the chemicals and these things, the gender-bending chemicals that they've, for some reason, put in the very things that contain the food we eat.
Yeah.
Hey, whoops, sorry, another accident, I suppose.
There's no doubt. All of these things are amassed against us. I was going to say back to the, if you don't mind, the theme of Americanism, and what seems to have been, at least to some degree, a Masonic operation behind the signing of the Declaration of Independence. I did a couple of years ago, because I used to be a strong, like most Americans, very much was indoctrinated to believe in the Declaration of Independence was like third Holy Testament, and I fairly abruptly realized 2 or 3 years ago that one could actually not believe the content of the Bible in Christianity and also believe the Declaration of Independence, and that's a whole other discussion. And I got into a debate by email with various fellows of the institute that I'm affiliated with, and some of them are nationally known law professors who had been, apologists for the Declaration for decades, and another. Do you know the historian Paul Gottfried?
Yes. Okay,
Paul's a fellow of our institute, and he's for decades before I realized it, Paul was aware that the Declaration was toxic. But I think that when I think of Americanism, and that's why I was asking who's introduced you to that term. I think of it as meaning essentially the doctrines of the Declaration of Independence, even more than because that would be the propositional, the proposition behind this so-called propositional society. I think, right? Agree?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So,
and that's why John Courtney Murray, who is someone who promoted Americanism in the late 50s and 60s, and he was promoted by the CIA. And he was a Jesuit priest, and his book, I think, was called "We Hold These Truths," the American Proposition. So he's obviously,
and he basically sold it to Catholics.
Yeah, and there was a debate within the Catholic Church among traditionalist Catholics, and there was it was sort of the Americanists versus the Catholics within the church about this debate. And
was the focus of the debate largely on the Declaration of Independence?
Declaration of Independence, but the real sticking point was the separation of church and state.
Okay.
Whereas that's not Catholic doctrine. And he tried to make it consistent with Catholic doctrine, which was a violation of various encyclicals, which subsequently, and very problematically for Catholics, popes have embraced the separation of church. Just recently, Pope Francis has said that proposition states aren't valid. I mean, I'm sorry, confessional states aren't valid. They're not.
Oh, Pope Francis said this?
Yeah.
Because I think one of the popes, I want to look into this now because I've been curious about it for a while, but the Catholic Church's reaction to the Declaration of Independence initially was, for a long time, very negative, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think they recognized the Freemasonic influence.
But I mean, in terms of the actual doctrines of the Enlightenment.
Yes, the Enlightenment itself is, well, I would say the Enlightenment itself at the final analysis is Luciferian.
Well, parts of it. Yeah, parts of it. But, I mean, it's difficult when you look at someone like John Locke, or I think Locke was a charlatan and a liar, but he cloaked himself very much in Protestantism. It's very difficult to know when someone is that clever with their public rhetoric what's really going on. But I think the doctrines of the Declaration are not compatible either with Christianity. In fact, in that email debate that I mentioned, it was pretty much a shutout. I mean, they were the people that, and I said we're talking about some people with national reputations as constitutional scholars and so forth, and we blew them away because when you just start put the Declaration of Independence and its propositions up against certain places in the Bible, and it's striking. And so what that means is, and by the way, those who signed it and that advocated, there was a great deal of dissent among the founding fathers about those doctrines. Not all of the signers themselves and others who didn't sign, not all of these people liked it, and some of them just threw up their hands and signed it. Do you know who Barry Shane is, Professor Barry Shane?
No.
At Colgate, you might want to look him up, and he's got some books. He's a historian, has done amazing analysis of the founding era and the fact that the vast majority of the population and many of the founders themselves did not accept the content of the Declaration of Independence. But to me, once it was like opening Pandora's box. Once that became, and I think by around 1800, I think the Declaration, I think the generation in America after the Revolution that was raised in the aura of or the penumbra of the Declaration of Independence, I think could never think the way that their parents or grandparents had.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult pill for many patriotic Americans to swallow because, of course, they've been kind of spoon-fed the American, the founding fathers, Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution. This is holy writ to many people, to most people. But like I said, even the Constitution itself is just ignored and cast aside.
I don't know how much you consider this too. There's another aspect of the difference between the separation of church and state versus a confessional state, and that is the displacement of canon law courts. As you know, throughout the history of Christian Europe, at least everywhere that I'm aware of, and I'm not a historian in this area or anything, but the churches had authority over family law, and the state didn't meddle there. You're aware of that, right?
Yeah. And
so once you have so the colonies here generally had, and some of the states, even after the Civil War, still had an official religion, an official Christian denomination. But once you go to, when you get away from that, you don't really have a very good basis for having canon law courts where family matters are decided within the church. See what I mean?
Yeah.
Because the church no longer has any legal standing to do that. And when you do that, you're guaranteeing the destruction of the family. So that, let's say, in Islam, you have, in the Western post-Christian countries, the Muslims are establishing Sharia law courts. Well, more power to them in one sense, because if they don't, they end up where we are, right?
Yeah.
So that's, Sharia law is heavily stigmatized, and there's some things about it, I'm sure. I haven't studied it, but I'm sure there's some disturbing things about it. But in general, that's what canon law based on the Bible would be like. There would be many similarities, but people are ignorant about it because they, it's Sharia law.
Yeah.
But you can't have anything worse than what we have now in the family courts. It couldn't possibly be worse.
No, it's horrible, and you have you have now homosexual couples adopting kids, and these things, and this is being accepted by the institutions. I've told this story a couple times, but a young lady was telling me how her kid was in trouble at school, and so she went for a conference, parents-teacher conference. She apparently had called his teacher a fag, and it turns out the teacher is a transvestite. And And she instructed us, so I can't ask him to respect him because I'm Catholic, but I can tell him not to call him names. But my attitude was, among all the adults, all those people in the room, the child had the healthiest reaction to this person. Mm-hmm. Because the entire school system is supporting the transvestite who's in charge of 25, 30 kids, and the school as an institution doesn't recognize a problem with that. That institution is overtly malevolent to the interest of those children, the educational and psychological well-being of those kids. And that's all about, and they're going to promote something like that and wonder why some kids emerge from that class a little confused, and they'll say this is an argument that no one really has any gender because they're confused. Look, well, yeah, you can screw up a kid if you really intended to screw up a kid's identity by subjecting them to crap like that, if you're malevolent enough, right?
Well, especially, I mean, what the children that are going to be, or teens that are going to be most vulnerable are the ones who have a mess at home to deal with. And
which more do because of divorce.
That's right.
And the breakdown of the moral order,
Yes.
Which is shown as what, a lot of that is just things tend to go this way, but they will definitely go that way if it's being promoted by Hollywood, the networks, the foundations, the educational system, the publishing houses like Time Life and these things, which there is ample evidence that these things. Remember, I say proof that the types of people who control the entertainment fair, the education, advertising, culture, the culture creators are malevolent, and that's psychological warfare.
See, you have to find a way to even slow this down. Never mind reverse it. You have to find a way to stigmatize not only the diabolical behavior itself, but the apathy toward it, the indifference toward it, so that it is stigmatized to do nothing. Okay, that is the first stigma, to do nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And because what we're commanded throughout the Bible and by Christ and by the apostles, as well as Moses onward, is have nothing to do with certain kinds of people. And you look at the categories of certain kinds of people, and they're in all of our churches, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that means that lots of people should have been excommunicated. Well, not only in the formal ecclesiastical sense, but from your family home, so that Christmas comes and there's someone not there. Why are they not there? Well, they did something so horrific that we're not going to talk to them until they have repented. Those are the commandments that were given.
Yeah.
So you had a structure for that in the initially in all the churches, and certainly in the liturgical churches like the Catholic churches, where you had canon law, and you had ways of adjudicating it. But when you think of, if you take either the ethnic conception of a church or the parish, geographic conception to an extreme, you lose sight of the fact that actually the church is something invisible. And if someone is excommunicated by God, then to be in conformity with God, you have to have yourself excommunicate them. And that stigmatizing process enables families to stay together. It enables child molesters to be stopped. It enables Marxist priests and theologians to be thrown out of Notre Dame, 80 years ago or whenever they first started showing up. So when you're not willing to exercise that, essentially obey the commandments that were given as to how we govern ourselves and how we watch over each other, if you're no longer willing to do that, you're going to be absolutely wide open to anybody who wants to come in and subvert you.
Yeah. In the name of inclusion, diversity, tolerance,
right.
Your community is destroyed. And if you're going to have a community, you have to have, at some level, the right to exclude, to maintain standards.
Well, you have a duty. You have a duty.
Yeah.
It's an existential. It's an existential decision. If you don't exclude, if you have, let's see, I think years ago there was something called the Conservative Club at Harvard. Okay, now some liberal wanted to join. I think it was a Marxist or whatever. So they said, well, we can't get funding unless we allow them. We won't get university funding, whatever. This is could have probably happened in many campuses. It probably did. In fact, I think I've heard of it happening at pro-life groups on campus.
Yeah.
And then, then somebody else joins and they call their friends, and pretty soon the board or the executive board of this club is now all composed of people who have the views contrary to the purpose of the club, right? So it's not just a right to excommunicate or exclude, it's a duty, because if you don't do it, then you have nothing left, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the churches are the first line of defense for that. The churches the churches did capitulate in letting civil government create family courts. Where St. Paul says, how can you go to court against your brother? In other words, and he says, can't even the least of you in the church resolve these? In other words, don't you have any resources among you so that you don't have to go out to pagans?
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's where, in the West, you have this principle. You have the church and the state being separate, and both checking. The church checks the state. It's it's a separate power. And of course, in the East, you have this. I think it's Sinfonia, where the church is part of the state. It defines the state. The weakness with the West is the church, in the interest of being separate from the state, has been increasingly marginalized. It has no power whatsoever. And it's just another group, right? Particularly in the United States, where you can be a Catholic, you can have your church, you can have your buildings and all that. You can go to church an hour a week, and you can worship whatever the hell you want, whatever, as long as you don't make too much trouble, right? And that's the deal. And so it's a trap, because you be comfortable and just don't make trouble. And that's what's happened in the United States. The church can't be militant because it has no real power, and that's why it's in the state it is now the 21st century. Again, it's an illiberal position to take, but that's American liberalism, Americanism. It's these presuppositions that we're given. But I would argue that even the promise of freedom that liberalism supposedly offers is a false promise. We don't have that freedom.
Of course, yeah.
We have consumerism,
right,
which creates the illusion of freedom, I guess you could say, for many people.
Yeah, it's a slavery. It's a form of slavery.
It's a form of slavery, and I could argue is that those who say that, regimes like Franco, there were dictatorships, and how can you have a state church? That's unfair, and these things. Well, America, by its own standards, fails. By its own proclaimed standards, because we don't have fair elections. It's corrupt to the core. I don't have any control, or I have no idea what's going on inside the Federal Reserve Board meetings. And these things decide the fate of the economy, who gets rich and who doesn't. I have no control over what's going on in the CIA or NSA. There's so much is. How many documents the government classifies every year? Millions of documents. And that's nothing to do with national security. It's there to cover up incompetence and corruption, or just to cover up accountability. Mm-hmm. These things. It's ridiculous. It's not. We're not. Our liberal society does not give us freedom. Doesn't give us oversight. Doesn't give us understanding of the workings of government. And we have to grope around in the dark and try to get some sort of inference from the evidence that we happen to see or touch, but we don't know what's really going on. All I know is that what's going on is corrupt, because that's what happens when you don't have sunlight. Corruption festers, and that's what we have. So my point is, even the claims of liberalism, they don't even provide what they say they provide. So their criticism of illiberal societies is I don't think it holds any water, at least not in my book.
Oh, I agree. No, I agree with you. In fact, I now I no longer believe. Well, it's just is in keeping with something taken for granted by the founding fathers, with all their flaws. Some of them were certainly Masons, although it's impossible, maybe at least very difficult to know in most cases how serious they were as Masons with the social members. But at least they did have a profound understanding that this experiment in self-government was completely dependent on the moral fabric of the people.
Yeah.
And that you couldn't expect people to govern themselves who were not moral. And I think Washington, ironically, because he wasn't, I don't think Washington was a Christian, but I think he ironically said a Christian people. Maybe it was Adams, I can't remember. But you can't expect self-government to work with the population we have. This is not a moral and religious people in the sense that they were talking about. There's no way. You know, that's where corruption comes from, people who don't have shame.
Yeah, and there's it's one thing. The world, if you read the papers or read the news, what's going on in the world, it's not as if the world is stricken with debilitating guilt.
No. And so, liberal versus illiberal government. I agree with you completely, Tim. We're so far past being able to boast about our form of government because we are not capable of making it work.
Well, I mean, the thing is, yeah, it depends on what level you're talking about. I would say, I mean, obviously the family structure is illiberal and appropriately so. And so so you take this liberal idea, individual rights and freedom, this atomized society. Well, this is why it serves the rich and the powerful, because it deprives the weak of any corporate representation to protect themselves, particularly the family. But I'm talking about parishes, communities, neighborhoods that associate, that get together and organize a block. And you could say maybe even another representation would be like a labor union or something, so they can organize. And so obviously they're going to preach to this, they're going to support this idea of liberalism because that's going to atomize society. And the ironic, I think I read this it was in Jane Billington's book, Fire in the Minds of Men, is ultimately the libertarian and the communist critique or analysis of society, of the nature of things. It's all materialist. Mm-hmm. And they provide a materialist nirvana or heaven. But it gets you to the same destination then, because ultimately it's you're dealing with, I guess you could say it's an ontological question, right? I mean, what is man? And it's this breaks everything. Is he just homo economicus? Is just economic nominalism? And this gets us back to the British system, the British ideology, which is the Newtonian world, where the universe is just gravity and inertia, and there's no teleological nature to the universe. There's no meaning. There's no God. Everything's just the laws of nature. Well, ironically, because Newton was also an alchemist, so it gets into black magic in these things.
Yeah,
but,
I think he gave up on that toward the end of his life.
Yeah.
But you're right. He did delve in it pretty deeply, and so did his friend John Locke.
Yeah.
But you said something very important a moment ago, Tim. The family is an illiberal institution. Mm-hmm. Let's bear down on what actually that means. What flesh that out. I agree with you, but I want you to.
Well, obviously, the family's not a democracy,
mm-hmm.
and
why not? Why is it not?
Because
parent-child or husband-wife or what?
Well, first because the one thing, obviously, is children. Children have to be raised and told what to do. And they're little, and they're babies, and as they get older, they gain a measure of independence and more until they leave the family. Then they start their own families in these things. But at the same time, with marriage, when you get married, a woman marries a man, takes his name in the traditional setting. This has an important function because she now belongs to him, but he has that responsibility, and that's the Christian understanding of marriage, is servant leadership. And in the Catholic Church, we have this saying that says, "Woman, obey your husband." And of course, whenever that says that, the men look at their wives in church and kind of laugh at them. But then the next is, "Man, love your woman as Christ so loved the church."
Well, yeah, this is from St. Paul.
Yeah. And what did Christ do? What happened to Christ? How did he express his love? He was crucified. So there's servant leadership there, and that requires a traditional understanding of marriage. So it's not. There is with a man, a healthy relationship where a man acknowledges his role as provider, protector for the wife and for the family, and because he provides that, the woman gives her loyalty to him, and the fruit of that is the children, right? It's not democratic. It's not rational.
Not democratic. It's not democratic, and that's another way in which our society now would be unrecognizable to Americans 100 years ago, except they were radical feminists 100 years ago. Even 150 years ago, they were radical feminists. But this is one of the places I think there is a ratchet effect. I don't think we can turn that back. I don't think we can. I mean, what could happen is some kind of apocalypse where, we have, I don't know, an EMP strike and, 20% of the population dies of starvation or disease or something like that can be like God hitting the reset button.
Yeah, life gets primal.
It gets primal. Yes, exactly, Tim. And when that happens, the gender relationships can return to their proper place.
That's an interesting observation because I was listening to there's I think she's in Canada. Girl White's Strayhorn is her name.
Oh yeah, Karen Strahan. She's great.
Yeah, and she was talking about this, and of course the example she cites has since got off into gender confusion. But the show The Walking Dead.
No, I don't really watch TV.
The Walking Dead. It's about a zombie apocalypse.
Okay.
And a few years ago, there's a whole zombie craze going on, and I watched a few seasons of it. But someone made the observation that in The Walking Dead is one of the few TV shows where the men are unambiguously masculine and there's positive male role models. And they asked her this, and she goes, "Well, that's obvious. Why? Because it's a post-apocalyptic movie, and there's no bureaucratic bullshit anymore. Men have to be men, and women have to be women." But since then, the show started promoting homosexuality and lesbianism and all that stuff. But I'm saying it was an interesting observation is that in that post-apocalyptic primal existence, you can't fantasize about these things anymore. You don't have all the bureaucracy and all the accoutrements of civilization to indulge these fantasies. You have to get down to business again.
Well, what we call the empowerment of women has destroyed many major civilizations going back, as far as we know, probably back 4,000 years, as far as we have, available evidence.
Yeah.
People can't even wrap their heads around what you just said about the headship of the husband, even if they claim to be, Bible-believing Christians or traditional Catholics or whatever. They don't understand that the opposite of this is what the Bible calls an abomination, which is to say, feminism is a form of witchcraft. It is it is related to, in a certain sense, devil worship, and it will destroy your family, it will destroy your society,
and Gnosticism, I think, yeah.
Actually, because you mean the gender confusion.
Yeah,
sure.
It's in the Gnosticism, and because people, naturally, because there's nature. And so you can go against nature as much as you can, but it reasserts itself in ways. And a good example is there's a noise at night. The wife will go, "Honey, go check that out," right? In the vast majority of cases, she's going to send the husband to go check what the noise is out. So people, but you're right. People have internalized it so much that now, again, what I said is so counter to the zeitgeist or the pieties of liberalism. Modern liberalism.
It's deeply offensive.
Yeah.
Very deeply offensive. And I'll just say something of basic economics about the economics of feminism and of gender, what's called equity feminism. If you have two-income families with husband and wife, both out there taking careers, which are desirable careers, not flipping hamburgers, but desirable careers that make enough income to raise a family on, and you concentrate that wealth in one marriage, you're taking it away from another marriage.
Yes.
And what feminism has done by sending and Eleanor Roosevelt of all people, this hero of first wave feminism, warned about this, I think in the 1930s, and she later sort of backed off because we were headed that way no matter what. But you basically are throwing tens of millions of families under the bus into permanent poverty as long as you have women taking those jobs. And
that appeared to be a plan of the oligarchs when they created feminism.
It could be.
Yeah.
It could be. But my chief interest in it is that now it's everybody. Everybody is a part of this. It's my own family. Mm-hmm. Basically every church, every pastor I know I mean, James Dobson, the head of Focus on the Family until he retired about 5 years ago, admitting that, quote, we've lost every major battle. Oh, I wonder why. When John McCain nominated Sarah Palin as his running mate, Dobson said they had this huge, revival meeting where they were shouting and thanking God because they're finally getting their evangelical feminists. Of course, he wouldn't admit that she's a feminist, although Palin herself has said, yeah, I'm a Christian feminist. Her family is in disaster. Her son and daughter, complete disaster. And she was a disaster as governor because she allowed the gay civil unions benefit thing to go through, and she put a Planned Parenthood attorney on the Supreme Court of Alaska. But anyway, my point is, people don't understand that when you have these women taking these places of leadership over men, you're sending a role model, a message to girls all over the country that this is a desirable way for a woman to go out and live. What doesn't matter what happens to her children and grandchildren. She destroys her house. She destroys her family.
And like I said, it's not like the roles are interchangeable.
They're not interchangeable. No. In fact, the Bible makes it very clear they're not. And if someone, I'm sure a good part of this audience is not a Christian, that's fine. But just look at it as a political and economic and social economic thing. You simply can't function. I mean, if you look at Black America, it's a female. It's the idea of the family in the inner city Black community is the mother and the children with no father. That's the norm. And who goes to college? If blacks go to college, it's mostly black females. If blacks go to graduate school, it's mostly black females. And so men have been completely removed from the raising of children in the black community. And the average black man knows he's not going to be able to go out and compete for jobs against white women. He can't. It's not going to happen. It's not that he's not capable of performing. He's not even going to work through high school with that goal in mind.
Well, because he came from a broken home to begin with. He doesn't have the role model to begin with.
He has nothing going for him. And society decided, you know what? We don't need him. We'll give these jobs to women. We don't need him. So that we've written off Black America in order to bring women up to this level, which is also now destroying white America.
Well, yeah, I always said that the much often heard complaint about the wage gap. It's ridiculous because men and women don't participate equally in the workforce, so you can't go by that. If you control for other factors, actually that gap does narrow significantly. These things, a whole lot of factors. It's a bogus argument, but I would argue to the extent that the wage gap has closed, that's regression, because that symbolizes that women have become wage earners and they're not taking care of their family, their children.
That's absolutely right. And there are some Stefan Molyneux, who's a complicated character. He had some statistic in I think it was a recent one, about how in certain competitive career fields, women are now making more money than men. They are now, I think, something like 60% of the people in graduate school, and I think maybe more than 60. I think like 65% of college students are female. What we have is an inversion. Well, what happens to those men? How are those men going to support a family and children? Are those women going to marry down? Women don't like to marry down.
They don't. No.
So
no, and you also have often you hear the wage gap cited, but they never hear about the gap that exists between like workplace accidents and deaths, where it's overwhelmingly they're men. No one is that sexism? Because men do dangerous work, women usually don't, despite what you watch on television. So yeah, but I mean you're familiar with the Nicholas Rockefeller, what Aaron Russo said. I think it was an Alex Jones interview. Where,
I think you mentioned this the other day, didn't you?
Yeah, he said that feminism is about flooding the labor market to cut wages in half.
Right.
And so they've been liberated to become wage slaves. All that. Yep. Think about the economic value of a traditional homemaker.
Right.
It's not taxable.
Yeah, well, feminism, feminism cannot avoid destroying the middle class, especially the lower middle class. It absolutely destroys it because it takes men out of situations where they could support a family and buy a home. And no society can survive that. So that's why we're importing Hispanics and everybody else, is because we have the demographic winter, which we've created largely by by brainwashing women into going out and competing with men. It's the most suicidal thing a society could do.
And looking at their reproductive gift as a disease.
Yeah.
Having babies and these things. And it's been so internalized that I mean, look at the young girls that go to college to have a career. I mean, to do what? To push papers for some, corporation?
And they don't generally like, these women today in this society don't generally like men.
Yeah, that's a whole other, yeah.
Well, because they think, well, I'm more of a man than you are.
Yeah.
Right?
And they're trying to compete on that level.
Right.
And again, all this goes against the zeitgeist, but it's true. And that the zeitgeist has been created, by the media and these things to alter expectations and these things. But it's the traditional expectation is what comports with nature, which is why when women comported with that, conformed to their nature, there's less tension. Now there's more tension because they're trying to go against nature. Right. It's a war on nature. Again, it's what I'm saying is a liberal. But it just, women aren't happy. They're not happy with they're not going to be happy when they're 40 years old. And they've put 15, 20 years into a company, and all they have is an empty apartment.
Yes,
to come home
and women, to be frank about it, women who are not happy tend to specialize in destroying other people's marriages. A lot of marriages are destroyed by gossip campaigns of women talking to their daughters, their sisters, their cousins, their friends, their neighbors. Well, you should divorce him. He doesn't treat you well enough. I mean, I don't watch Oprah, but someone said to me the other day, every time he turns on Oprah, she's advising some woman to dump her husband.
As she's someone you should listen to on personal advice.
Right.
Or she's got a big house, so she must be smart. She has several big houses, so she must be smart.
But again, this is reflected in the biblical understanding of what happens to women when they fall into their fallen nature. We have our fallen nature as well, but
yes.
There's quite a lot in the Bible about women getting into gossip and backbiting. Well, why? Have we not seen that? I mean, is that not a fact? Women themselves admit that their friends do nothing but sit around and gossip.
Yes.
And I have a friend that said his kids came back from a hockey game or something, and he was watching his brother play or whatever, as a little kid, or the daughter. I think it was the daughter. He said all the mommies were sitting around complaining about their husbands.
Yeah, I've seen that myself.
So,
in fact, I have, well, I wouldn't say personal, but I have a very close experience with someone who's suffering with that, where someone listening to other women talk about how bad men are, and she's then projecting it onto her own husband.
Oh, yeah. It's very, I absolutely guarantee. I mean, my marriage, I lost my kids in the family court. We didn't get into that stuff. But, the female members in my extended family and in our church helped make that happen. And they have no shame. It's compulsive.
That bitter women become marriage therapists.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's this requires sort of a kind of a honesty about the true nature of men and women, and being able to laugh at ourselves a little bit. That's one thing that feminists are able to do. They don't have to laugh at themselves. Men are laughed at a lot. Commercials and movies and these things.
Getting back to taboos and excommunication, women are the first line of defense against other women's misbehavior. So if women don't tolerate gossipy, backbiting, vicious women, and they stigmatize them, then it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
It's not as if you can make laws to stop this stuff. It's at the individual level.
But even conservative women, they've sort of internalized a lot of the feminism.
Oh, there are no conservative women.
Yeah, exactly. It's like what's yours is mine. What's yours is ours, what's mine is mine attitude I see a lot.
Yep, absolutely. Oh, there's no, it's almost impossible. There is a very small number of conservative women or women that I would consider to be genuinely Christian in their outlook or biblical in the outlook. Very, very small number. And so the thing is that, in fact, this relates to what we started out talking about earlier. You could run by these women all this explanation, the historical explanation of these conspiracies and the oligarchs and the alliances of the bankers and the corruption of the universities, and you'd have every conservative, quotation marks, conservative and conservative women in America agreeing with you. Oh, great stuff, Tim. Great stuff. Yeah. But you know what? They're part of it. Because they're agreeing with you at the theoretical level. But at the practical level, they're out destroying each other's marriages. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
The conspiracy is them. Because there's no oligarch. There was no oligarch standing in my kitchen. You understand?
Yeah.
There was no, the CFR meeting didn't happen in my living room. Somebody carried it out. And without even a phone call from the CFR. So what I'm saying is that the theory of how this has happened at the macro level, historically, whatever, is all very fascinating. But if you could wipe it all out instantly, we would still have the people that we are. And we're not people who can govern ourselves. We're not people who can help other people save their marriages. It's more fun to destroy a marriage than to help save it. It's hard work to save marriages. It's easy to destroy marriages. And that's a thing that I try to provoke people with. And what I liked very much about your interview with Joe is it ended on that note where he was basically telling people, if you want a chance to make your marriage work, you've got to look in the mirror and figure out, what your basic problems are.
Mm-hmm. We've met the enemy and they is us, right?
That's right.
So, well, wow, we're well over 2 hours. Think we covered it all?
Yeah, great. I enjoyed it very much. Good stuff.
So, okay, well, I'll let you go. So that, let me read your bio again here. That's John Haskins, Senior Fellow for Public Understanding of Law, Propaganda and Culture Revolution at the Inter-American Institute for Philosophy, Government and Social Thought. Where can people follow your work? Do you have any place where you post your articles? And
I have actually kind of gone incommunicado for a while. I occasionally do get a request for an interview, but I haven't been publishing articles for over 5 years now. And I do actually get into regular debates on email with colleagues
okay.
and fight these things out with colleagues. But I may start writing again. I'm not sure. I'm even thinking about starting a YouTube channel. I don't know if I'll do that. But anyway, thank you very much, Tim.
Okay, well, thanks for coming on the show. I'll let you go. And perhaps sometime in the near future, we'll maybe examine more, I guess, get deeper in maybe some of the things you brought up tonight, or maybe some other topic will come up. So,
very good. And I'll hook you up with some other possible guests that you might be excited about.
Yeah, just shoot me an email.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, and good night then. Bye-bye.